It was January 28th, 1986, and I was a kid sitting in a cramped classroom, my desk facing a bulky television set. You know the kind. Grainy screen, static flickering around the edges. Our teacher, Mrs. Collins, had dragged it in just for this occasion. We were about to watch the space shuttle Challenger take off. It was supposed to be a day for the history books. A teacher, Krista McAuliffe, would be the first civilian in space. For a bunch of wide-eyed elementary school kids, it was beyond exciting. We were told to write about it in our journals. I remember my entry. I want to go to space, too. I couldn't explain why, but from the moment the countdown started, something felt wrong. Not like anything was going to go wrong with the launch. More like I wasn't supposed to be there, watching it. It was an inexplicable dread, something deep, ancient, gnawing at my chest. But I was just a kid. What did I know about fear? The engines ignited, and Challenger lifted off into that bright, cloudless sky. The room erupted in cheers, but I didn't join in. I was glued to the screen, every nerve in my body screaming. But I didn't know why. 73 seconds. That's how long it took. 73 seconds. And then it happened. 1 minute, the shuttle was soaring. The next, it shattered, consumed in a fireball that painted the sky with smoke trails twisting like fingers from some unseen hand. The room went dead silent. I could still hear the roar of the explosion in my ears, echoing, growing louder, drowning out everything else. It was as if time had slowed down, every second stretching into an eternity. But it wasn't the explosion that terrified me. No, it was what came after. Amid the chaos on screen, I saw something no one else seemed to notice. At first I thought it was just debris, a chunk of metal or insulation drifting through the smoke. But then it moved, unnaturally. It twisted, curved, like it was alive, writhing through the flames. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. The shape, if you could even call it that, seemed to be watching. Not just floating there. It had purpose. And I swear to this day, it looked right at me through the screen. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My classmates gasped. Some cried, but I didn't hear them anymore. All I could hear was the low, pulsating hum, something no one else seemed to notice, a sound that vibrated in my skull. And that thing, whatever it was, kept coming closer. My heart raced as the figure came into focus. It wasn't human, not really. It was more like a silhouette, a shadow made of ash and smoke, swirling and shifting. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were empty, dark pits. Yet somehow they burned into me. No one else saw it. It was impossible, I know. There was no way. But it was there, and it was looking through the TV, through the screen, straight at me. I don't remember much after that. Just blackness. When I woke up, I was in the nurse's office, pale and shaking. They told me I fainted, passed out from the shock of the explosion. They said it was normal, that I wasn't the only one. Kids were having nightmares all across the country after witnessing such a tragedy. But I didn't tell anyone what I had really seen. How could I? They'd think I was crazy. For a while I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that it was just the shock, my mind playing tricks. But then, the dreams started. Every night, I'd see it again. The explosion, the smoke, that figure twisting through the air. And each time, it got closer. At first it just hovered in the distance, but slowly, night by night, it began to reach for me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me, even after I opened my eyes. The worst part, I wasn't the only one. It was months after the disaster when I found out. I overheard my mom on the phone with another parent, talking about some kid from my class who had been having nightmares, too. Nightmares about a shadowy figure in the flames. The parents were brushing it off as trauma, some kind of collective grief. But I knew better. I wasn't alone. One night, the dreams changed. The figure didn't just hover in the distance anymore. It stepped through. I don't know how else to explain it, but it was like it crossed over. I woke up, but I wasn't in my room. I was back in that classroom, sitting in front of the TV, the smell of burning metal thick in the air. And there it was, standing in front of me, towering, stretching its arms out, those hollow eyes boring into mine. It whispered something I can't quite remember. It was like a language I didn't know, but somehow understood. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was sit there and let the terror wash over me. And then I woke up. For real this time. I didn't sleep for days after that. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but deep down, I knew. Whatever I saw that day, whatever crossed over from that explosion, it hadn't left. Not really. It was still here, waiting, watching. I don't watch live TV anymore, not since then. I don't like how the static flickers at the edges of the screen, how the signal sometimes cuts out just for a second, replaced by that same low hum I heard that day. I always change the channel, turn it off, anything to stop the noise. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the static creeps back in, I catch a glimpse of it, just for a second, a figure in the corner of the screen, twisted, made of smoke and ash, watching me, and I wonder how much longer I have. It was a gray Sunday morning when I found myself at Dealey Plaza, standing where history had once been shattered into 1,000 unanswered questions. The air was still, almost heavy with the weight of everything that had happened here so many decades ago. November 22nd, 1963. Everyone knew the date. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I wasn't even alive when it happened, but like millions of others, I'd been drawn to it over the years, sucked into the swirling vortex of conspiracy theories, conflicting testimonies, and ominous cover-ups. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by nature. At least, I wasn't. But something about this particular story clung to me, like the persistent dampness of Dallas in late fall. For years, I'd read every book, watched every documentary, devoured every scrap of evidence I could find. Oswald, Ruby, the Mafia, the CIA. Nothing quite made sense, but the puzzle pieces always seemed to fit together just enough to keep me digging. And now, here I was, in the heart of it all. The tour guide's voice droned on, but I wasn't listening. I stood beneath the Texas School Book Depository, staring up at that 6th-floor window, the place where Oswald supposedly fired those fatal shots. The guide said something about the angles, the rifle, the grassy knoll, things I already knew by heart, but none of it mattered at that moment. I felt something else, a presence. I've never been superstitious, and I don't claim to see ghosts or anything like that. But standing there, something crept over me, a cold, gnawing sensation that crawled along my spine. I glanced around, hoping to find some logical reason for the feeling, but everyone around me was absorbed in their own thoughts. The tour group moved along toward the memorial, but I lingered, unable to shake the chill. And then I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, like the softest breath against my ear. I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. Only the empty plaza stretching out in front of me, and the distant hum of traffic. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Look closer. I froze. The voice was unmistakable, though still soft, almost pleading. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. I scanned the area again. Nothing. The others were too far ahead now to have said anything, and yet I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, something watching. I don't know why I did it, but I obeyed the voice. I walked slowly toward the spot where the motorcade had passed on that day, toward the white painted X on the asphalt, marking the exact place where Kennedy had been shot. My breath was shallow, and each step felt like a battle against an invisible force. The moment I reached the spot, a sharp pain shot through my temples, as if a steel band was tightening around my skull. I gasped, stumbling forward, clutching my head. The world around me seemed to warp and twist. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by something else. Shouts, screams, the deafening roar of gunfire. I was no longer standing in the present. It was as if I had been pulled back in time, yanked into the very moment of the assassination. I saw the motorcade, clear as day, the shiny black limousine moving in slow motion, the crowd cheering along the sidewalk, and there, perched in the window of the book depository, was Oswald, or someone who looked like him. He was aiming just as history had said, but something wasn't right. I watched, horrified, as the rifle discharged, the sound shattering the air, but instead of hitting Kennedy, the bullet seemed to vanish, swallowed by the chaos of the moment. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but my vision blurred again. The scene shifted. This time, I was in the basement of the Dallas Police headquarters. Oswald was there, handcuffed, surrounded by officers, just as it had happened on November 24th. But something was different. I could hear his voice clearer than I ever should have. They lied. Oswald muttered under his breath, his eyes darting around. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Before I could process what was happening, Jack Ruby burst from the crowd, a gun in his hand. I wanted to scream, to shout for someone to stop him, but I couldn't move. Everything was playing out, just as it had been captured on live television all those years ago. Ruby raised the revolver and fired a single shot into Oswald's stomach. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the basement. But instead of collapsing, Oswald turned his head toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have to stop it." I recoiled, stumbling backward as the world snapped back into focus. I was no longer in 1963. I was back in Dealey Plaza, gasping for air. The tour group was gone, and I was alone. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen, lurking just beyond my understanding, remained. My heart thundered in my chest, and my skin prickled with the cold sweat of fear. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know if it was a hallucination or something more sinister, but I do know one thing. Oswald wasn't alone. Whether he pulled the trigger or not, there was something much darker at play. I could feel it, pulsing in the air around me, a malevolent force that refused to be buried by time or history. And now, that force was watching me, following me. It had whispered to me, shown me things no one should see. And no matter how hard I tried to shake it, I knew it wasn't finished with me. The mystery of Dealey Plaza wasn't just about a conspiracy or a political assassination. It was something far more terrifying, something that went beyond the physical world, and somehow I had been pulled into its orbit, a prisoner of a history that refused to die. And I knew deep down it would never let me go. I'll never forget July 15th, 1974. It was a day that would change everything, a day I wish I could erase from my memory. I was working the night shift at WXLT-TV in Sarasota, Florida, and I had been preparing for the evening news. As I looked through the rundown, a chill crept down my spine. There was something about that day, an unsettling aura that lingered in the air. Christine Chubbuck was there, as always, a bright-eyed reporter with a talent for human interest stories. She was passionate, driven, and fiercely dedicated to her work. But beneath that polished exterior, I had begun to sense that she was struggling. There were whispers in the break room, concerns about her mental health, her frustrations with the station, and the pressures of the industry. Yet, she had a way of masking it all with her smile. As the newscast approached, I noticed Christine's demeanor had changed. She was quieter than usual, her brow furrowed with an intensity that I had never seen before. I brushed it off. We all had our days, right? The clock ticked down, and the studio buzzed with the usual pre-show energy. I could hear the chatter of the crew, the sound of cameras adjusting, and the distant hum of the broadcast tower. Finally, it was showtime. I took my seat at the anchor desk, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline. Christine joined me, her presence somehow calming, despite the tension in the room. We opened the show with routine headlines, the typical banter we shared, but I could feel something brewing beneath the surface. Then came the segment about a shooting at a local restaurant. I watched Christine with a mix of admiration and concern as she reported the story with a composed facade. Her voice was steady, her delivery professional, but there was something haunting in her eyes. When she transitioned to the next segment, it felt like the air had thickened, and now, in keeping with Channel 40's policy of bringing you the latest in blood and guts, and in living color, you're going to see another first, an attempted suicide. The words hung in the air, a jarring statement that sent chills through me. I watched in disbelief as she reached beneath the desk, and my heart raced, pounding against my chest like a drum. What was she doing? The moment felt surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. And then it happened. In an instant, the world around me shattered. Christine pulled out a revolver, her expression eerily calm. Time slowed as I realized what was about to unfold. My brain screamed at me to intervene, to stop her, but my body was frozen in shock. I wanted to shout, to grab the gun from her hands, but I couldn't move. The cameras captured everything, broadcasting her act of desperation lived to countless homes. The deafening bang echoed in the studio, a sound I can't unhear. Christine collapsed, her body crumpling beneath the weight of her choice. The screen went blank, and the silence that followed was an abyss, swallowing everything in its wake. Chaos erupted. The station plunged into disorder as we scrambled to regain control. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, shock, horror, disbelief, my heart racing in my chest as the reality of what just transpired sunk in. The director cut to a commercial break, but I remained rooted in my seat, staring at the empty space where Christine had just been. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened, but inside, the walls of the studio closed in on me. I could hear my colleagues whispering, their voices tinged with disbelief and fear. "Did that really just happen?" one asked. I wanted to scream, to tell them that it had, that I had witnessed a tragedy unlike any other. News of Christine's on-air suicide spread like wildfire. As the hours turned into days, the tragedy left a stain on the community. People grappled with the shock, discussing what they had seen in hushed tones, questioning how someone so talented could feel so lost. I was left to sift through the wreckage of that night, haunted by the image of Christine's final moments. I tried to understand why she did it. Some speculated about her depression and unfulfilled dreams. Others pointed fingers at the media's obsession with sensationalism. But deep down, I knew that her struggles went beyond what anyone could see. I had worked alongside her, shared laughter and long nights, and yet I had missed the signs, the subtle changes, the sadness lurking behind her eyes. The aftermath was a blur of interviews, discussions, and public scrutiny. I felt the weight of my own guilt. wondering if I could have done something, anything, to prevent it. But it was too late. Christine was gone, and all that remained was a haunting silence. Weeks turned into months, but her name echoed in my mind like a ghost. Every time I stepped into the studio, I felt her absence, an emptiness that would never be filled. I became increasingly aware of the fragility of life, the delicate balance of mental health that so many of us overlooked. Christine's tragic end served as a grim reminder of the battles fought behind closed doors, of the pain that often goes unseen. It sparked a movement, a conversation about mental health that was long overdue. I realized that we needed to prioritize empathy and understanding in a world driven by ratings and sensationalism. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't over. Each time I turned on the news, I expected to see her face, to hear her voice echoing through the airwaves. The final broadcast had left an indelible mark on my soul, urging me to remember her, to honor her memory by advocating for those who silently suffer. As I continue to work in this industry, I carry Christine's legacy with me. Her tragic end reminds me every day that behind every story there are lives, complex, fragile, and deserving of compassion. In the echo of that fateful broadcast, I vow to listen more closely, to look beyond the headlines, and to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. For Christine Chubbuck, for every soul lost to the darkness, I will never forget.